The call came in at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, and I remember the exact time because I was still in my car, in the parking lot of the hospital where I work, finishing the last of a gas station coffee that had gone cold somewhere, on the drive over. My brother's name lit up the screen. I almost didn't answer. I should have trusted that instinct. Dad's lawyer called me, he said, before I even got a word out. There's a meeting Thursday, the estate stuff, you need to be there. Our father had passed 8 weeks earlier, pancreatic cancer, fast and ugly, the way it usually goes. He'd been a quiet man who kept his finances the way he kept everything else. Organized, private, and entirely to himself. I didn't know what the estate looked like. I assumed my brother did, because he'd been the one managing Dad's affairs the last 2 years, the one with power of attorney, the one who'd moved back to Tucson to help out. I had offered to do the same, but my brother, his name is Brett, and I'll be using that name for the rest of this, had told me it was fine. He had it handled. I believed him. That was my first mistake. I'm 31. I'm a registered nurse. I work long shifts. I live in a 1-bedroom apartment in Phoenix with a rescue greyhound named Opal, and until 8 weeks ago, I thought my family was the ordinary, imperfect, fundamentally decent kind. The kind that argues at Thanksgiving and forgets birthdays but shows up when it actually counts. Brett is 38, 7 years older than me. He sells commercial real estate, or he did. I'll get to that. He married his wife Kala about 4 years ago, a woman I barely know because they live in Tucson, and I live in Phoenix, and our lives just don't overlap much. I'd never had a real problem with her. She seemed fine. She seemed like a lot of things she turned out not to be. The meeting was at the lawyer's office, a place called Marfield & Associates, which sounds impressive, but is actually a 2-room suite above a dry cleaner on Oracle Road. The lawyer's name was Mr. Harwick, late 60s, reading glasses on a cord around his neck, the kind of man who looks like he has been sitting behind that desk since 1987 and intends to die there. Brett was already there when I arrived, and Kala was with him, which I hadn't expected. I didn't say anything about it. I sat down across from them. I put my bag on the floor. Mr. Harwick shuffled papers and looked at us, the way lawyers look at people, when they already know the conversation is going to be painful. Your father left a will, he said, and I want to be straightforward with you both. It's not complicated, but there are some matters attached to the estate that we need to discuss before we talk about distributions. The will itself was simple. The house, a 3-bedroom ranch on the east side of Tucson that my parents had bought in 1994, was to be split equally between Brett and me. Dad also had a brokerage account and a savings account, and those were to be divided the same way. 50-50, clean down the middle. I felt something loosen in my chest. It was fair. It was what I would have hoped for. I looked at Brett, expecting him to look relieved, or at least neutral. He was looking at his hands. Now, Mr. Harwick said, before we discuss the distribution timeline, I need to inform you of an encumbrance on the property. That word, encumbrance. I didn't know what it meant in the specific legal sense, but it didn't sound like anything good. There is a lien on the house, he said, in the amount of $412,000. The room went quiet in a way that had weight to it. I'm sorry, I said. Can you say that again? He said it again. I turned to look at Brett. He was still looking at his hands. What is that from? I asked Mr. Harwick, though some part of me was already looking at my brother when I said it. Mr. Harwick looked at Brett too. Brett cleared his throat. Dad needed money, he said, for the medical bills. The last round of treatment wasn't covered the way we thought. There were gaps in the Medicare supplement, and some of the specialists were out of network, and it added up faster than we expected. I took out a home equity line to cover it. You took out a home equity line, I repeated. I had power of attorney. I know you had power of attorney. It was for Dad's care. I sat with that for a moment. $412,000. Dad's house, according to a recent appraisal Mr. Harwick had in his folder, was worth approximately $490,000, which meant that after the lien was satisfied, Brett and I would be splitting somewhere in the neighborhood of $78,000. $39,000 each instead of the $245,000 we each should have received. I asked Mr. Harwick if I could see the documentation. He produced it. I am not a financial expert, but I am a woman who reads carefully, and I sat in that office and I read every page. The home equity line had been drawn over a period of 14 months. The final draw was made 6 weeks before my father died. I looked up. 6 weeks before he died, I said. There were still draws on this account 6 weeks before he died. The bills were ongoing, Brett said. What bills? I said. He was in hospice by then. Hospice is covered. Kala put her hand on Brett's arm. That was the moment I understood that she knew everything and had known it for a long time. I asked Mr. Harwick if he could give Brett and me a few minutes alone. He said of course, and he left the room, and when the door closed I turned to my brother and I said very quietly, "Tell me the truth." He didn't. Not right away. He gave me the version he'd been rehearsing about the medical costs and the out-of-network bills, and how fast everything had moved. but his voice had a quality to it that I recognized from childhood. A kind of over-smoothness, the way he used to sound when he was telling our parents he'd already done his homework or already cleaned his room. Brett has always been a good liar. He just isn't quite as good as he thinks he is. I asked him to show me the receipts. He said he'd have to find them. I told him to find them. He said it might take some time. I said I had time. Calla said my name. She said it in a tone that was meant to be conciliatory, but landed somewhere closer to warning, and I looked at her and I said, please don't. And then I looked back at my brother and I said, I need you to tell me where that money went. He left the room. He said he needed some air. He was gone for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on Mr. Harwick's wall. When he came back in, he sat down and he folded his hands on the table and he said, some of it went to business expenses. Business expenses, I said. I've been in a difficult spot. The market has been rough and I had some deals fall through, and I had some debts I needed to clear, and I needed to bridge a gap. I want to describe how I felt in that moment because I think it matters. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. What I felt was something close to a physical sensation, like someone had taken the floor out from under me, but slowly, so slowly, that I didn't fully register it until I was already falling. Our father, who had been sick and scared, and spending his last months believing his son was managing his affairs with care, who had trusted Brett completely, because Brett was right there, right in Tucson. The one with the folder and the power of attorney, and the reassurances. Our father, who had built that house into something over 30 years, who had made his mortgage payments, and kept his lawn and put money carefully away. He had died with $400,000 borrowed against his house, and a significant portion of it had gone not to his medical care, but to bail out his son's failing business. I asked how much was actually medical bills. Brett looked at the table. About 160, he said. And the rest? He didn't answer. I didn't push it right then. I gathered my things. I said I would be in touch. And I walked out of the office and sat in my car and called my best friend, whose name is Tori, and I said, I need you to help me find a lawyer. What happened next took 4 months and is not, honestly, a story I can tell cleanly in chronological order, because it wasn't clean. It was phone calls and emails and certified letters, and a lot of nights where I couldn't sleep, and a lot of mornings where I drove to work, feeling like I was operating from behind a sheet of glass. What I can tell you is what we found. Brett had drawn on the home equity line 26 times over 14 months. Of those 26 draws, my attorney, a woman named Ms. Osi, who practices estate and probate law in Phoenix, and who I will recommend to anyone who asks, was able to document that approximately $160,000 went to legitimate medical expenses, specialist bills, a short-term in-home care arrangement before hospice, medications, a hospital bed and supplies, real expenses, real things Dad needed. The remaining $252,000 had gone elsewhere, some to credit card debt in Brett's name, some to what appeared to be a private loan repayment to someone in Calla's family. Some, and this part was harder to trace, to what looked like a down payment on a commercial property that Brett and a business partner had been trying to acquire, a deal that ultimately didn't close. He had used our dying father's house as a line of credit to prop up his own financial life, and then he had sat across from me in that lawyer's office with Calla's hand on his arm and told me it was for the medical bills. Ms. Osi filed a civil claim. She was clear with me from the beginning about what we could and couldn't prove, and what the likely outcomes were. Power of attorney is broad. Abuse of it is actionable. But it's a difficult case to make without very clean documentation, and Brett was not a man who kept very clean documentation. We were looking at a contested process. It was going to take time and money, and there were no guarantees. I said I understood, and I meant it. What I did not anticipate was my mother. My parents had been divorced since I was 12. My mother had remarried, was living in Albuquerque, and had been present at the funeral, but largely peripheral, to the estate proceedings. Which made sense because she and my father had been separated for nearly 2 decades. I'd kept her loosely informed about what I'd found. I thought she would be horrified. I thought she would be on my side, or at least neutral. She'd always had a somewhat complicated relationship with Brett. She used to say he was hard to reach, but he was still her son. She called me on a Sunday afternoon in October, 3 months into the legal process. I was on my couch with Opal, watching rain hit my windows. She said, I need to talk to you about Brett. I said, okay. She said she'd spoken to him. She said he was devastated. She said he'd had a really hard couple of years. The market, the marriage, the stress of managing Dad's illness, and she felt like the legal action was going to destroy him. She said she understood I was hurt, but she wanted me to consider whether there was a way to resolve this within the family. I asked her what that would look like. She said Brett was willing to pay back $100,000 over time if I would drop the civil claim. I want to be precise here. My brother had taken $252,000 that belonged to both of us. He was offering, through my mother, to repay $100,000 of it. Less than half. If I agreed to take no further legal action, which would mean he walked away with a net gain. I said no. My mother's voice changed. Not dramatically. She's not a dramatic woman. But something went cooler in it, more careful. She said she thought I was being rigid. She said she thought I was letting my anger make my decisions. She said, "You've always had trouble with forgiveness." I don't know how long I'd been carrying that sentence before she said it. Because it didn't feel new when it arrived. It felt like something that had always been in our family's air. This idea that my brother's difficulties were circumstances, and my expectations were character flaws. That he needed grace, and I needed to provide it. That the reasonable thing for me to do was to absorb the loss and call it love. I said, "Mom, he stole from Dad," she said. "He made a mistake." I said, $252,000 is not a mistake, it's a decision. He made it over and over again for 14 months. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "If you push this, you're going to tear the family apart." I said, "Brett already did that." She didn't speak to me again for 6 weeks after that call. The legal process moved slowly and then quickly, the way these things sometimes do. Ms. O.C. sent a formal demand letter. Brett's attorney responded. There was a period of back and forth that I mostly stayed out of, because I had been advised to stay out of it, which was the right call, but was also one of the hardest things I've done. This idea of letting the facts speak while the person who'd upended everything went on with his daily life. During this time, Kala reached out to me twice. Once by text, which I didn't respond to. Once by phone, which I picked up without thinking because I didn't recognize the number she was calling from. She told me I was making a mistake. She told me Brett had struggled with addiction years ago, and I didn't know how hard recovery was. This was true. I did know about the addiction history. It was not a secret, but it was also a sentence deployed the way people deploy that kind of sentence. As explanation, as deflection, as something to make me feel small for expecting accountability. I told her I was sorry he'd struggled. I meant it. I also told her that his struggles didn't entitle him to $252,000 that didn't belong to him. She hung up. What nobody had anticipated, not Brett, not Kala, not my mother and son, honestly not even Ms. O.C., was the business partner. Brett's commercial property deal, the one that had never closed, had apparently left an unpaid balance with an investor who'd backed the project. When that investor's attorneys began their own process of recovering what they were owed, Brett's financial picture became a matter of record in a way it hadn't been before. What that picture showed was that he had been in significantly worse financial shape than even I had understood. There were other debts. There were other creditors. The home equity draws had not been the only thing he'd been juggling. Ms. O.C., once she had access to more of this information, had a clearer picture to work with. Brett's attorney, once Brett had a clearer picture of how much was now a matter of record, apparently had a frank conversation with his client. I was not in that conversation. I heard about it afterward, secondhand, in the form of a phone call from Ms. O.C. who said, "He wants to talk about settlement." The settlement negotiation took 3 weeks. I will not share the specific terms because those are confidential, but I will tell you that it was not $100,000 over time. It was more than that, structured in a way that protected my interests. And it included a formal acknowledgement, not a criminal charge, because what Brett had done, while morally indefensible, existed in civil rather than criminal territory, but a documented, signed acknowledgement of what had occurred. My attorney had pushed for that. So had I. I didn't want money only. I wanted a record that said what it said. Brett and Kala sold their house in Tucson. I don't know where they went after that. I don't need to know. The house, Dad's house, sold in February. It was a seller's market, even with the lien resolved. I took my share and I sat with it for a long time, before I decided what to do with it. There's a thing that happens when you come through something like this. People expect you to feel triumphant, or at least relieved. And I did feel some version of relief, but there's also a grief underneath it, that isn't about the money. It's about what you find out. It's about the version of your family you have to stop believing in, and replace with something more accurate, which sounds like a manageable task, but is in fact quite sad. My mother and I talk now. We've had long conversations, careful ones, the kind where you're both aware of how thin the ice is. She's apologized. Not fully, not with the kind of completeness I might have wanted, but enough. I can see that she was trying to save her son and it made her say things she shouldn't have said. I understand that. It doesn't mean I forgot them. It means I've decided to hold both things at once. There's a woman at my hospital, an older nurse named Beverly, who's been working the floor longer than I've been alive. She found me in the break room on a bad day about 2 months into all of this, when I was sitting with a cold cup of coffee looking at nothing. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just sat down across from me and said, "Whatever it is, you'll still be you on the other side of it." She didn't know how right she was. You don't know, when you're in the middle of it, that the thing trying to take something from you won't succeed. You find out afterward. My father's watch. A plain steel Seiko he'd worn every day since the early 90s had been sitting in a box at my brother's house. It was supposed to come to me. Dad had told me so, more than once, in the last year of his life. It had gotten lost in the chaos of the estate, and I had been afraid to ask for it directly during the legal proceedings, because I didn't want to give Brett anything to use. After the settlement was signed, OC sent one final letter, requesting the personal items that had been listed in the original estate inventory. The watch arrived in the mail 8 days later, in a padded envelope with no note. I took it to a watchmaker in Tempe who cleaned it and replaced the crystal and put a new band on it. It keeps perfect time. I wear it on Tuesdays, which was the day of that first phone call, and also the day Dad was admitted to hospice, and somehow also the day the settlement was signed. Tuesdays have a lot to answer for in my life. I figure if I wear it on Tuesdays, the watch is doing what it was meant to do. Beverly brought me a plant cutting from her kitchen windowsill last spring. A pothos, impossible to kill, she said, which is exactly what I needed. It lives on my counter next to Opal's water bowl. Every time I look at it, I think about what it means to be chosen by someone who didn't have to choose you. Beverly didn't have to sit down in that break room. She just did. I don't have a tidy ending to give you, because it wasn't tidy. My brother is somewhere I don't know, living a life I'm not part of. My mother and I are rebuilding something careful and small. I am still in my apartment, in Phoenix. Still driving to the hospital in the early mornings. Still finishing cold coffees in parking lots before shifts. But I have the watch, and the plant, and Opal asleep at the foot of the bed, and the knowledge that when it came down to it, I did not let someone take what wasn't theirs to take. That turned out to be enough. More than enough, actually. It turned out to be everything.